I'm going to read a couple of things from Without Saints, and as Diane said, that it's really a memoir in essays. I was really, at first I thought I wanted to write a traditional genre type of memoir with a very traditional narrative arc to it, but I realized that just wasn't working for me, and I was more interested in having these sort of brilliant and brutal snapshots that would sort of fade in quickly, then fade out, and then hopefully takes us someplace brighter, which I think as the book moves, it does. And it does move in a chronological order. So in that sense, that's somewhat traditional, because I think it'd be too confusing to have essays jumping around in different times. But it was at times challenging to write, but incredibly gratifying. And I'm really happy with how it looks. The book's beautiful, and it's just some great work. So the first thing I'm going to read is the first essay, called Pieces. And the name itself is kind of like a microcosm of the book. You know, the book itself is broken up into small essays, and this is sort of like the origin story. You know, like every hero of the book has an origin story, and it goes back to my mom. And I think about what my mom went. I thought it was important that this book start with sort of what my mom experienced and what she survived in order to become the woman that she is, which is a great, wonderful mom and great woman. And so just these brief little snapshots within this piece. And I do want to say, though, that tonight's reading, just to be an awareness that there's some references to self-harm and to abuse. So just letting you all know that that's part of the reading tonight. So the first piece is called Pieces. And I can't believe I'm using these things now. I'm actually using these readers, which is like so awful, but I'm just doing it. I'm giving into age, you know what I mean? I have to at this point. Pieces. When my mother was 8 years old, she climbed to the top of her neighbor's greenhouse and leapt, convinced she would fly. Her body crashed through the glass, and she landed on top of a table filled with bright yellow daffodils. Her right calf was badly cut, and after her neighbors rushed out to help her off the crumpled flowers and pick the glass out of her hair, they wrapped her leg, called her mom, and sent her home. My mom limped across the street and bled up the stairs of her house in Hull, Massachusetts. Her mom attended to her wound, and when her father returned from work, he pointed out all the blood still on the porch and said, "Do you know how this makes us look?" At night, my mother lay motionless in her bed and listened very carefully. Sometimes she was alone. Sometimes one or all of her sisters were with her. They waited to hear the stairs. They waited to see who their father would choose. When my mom was 16, she sat in the back of her parents' Oldsmobile as her mother drove. They were going to the pharmacy to buy pantyhose. About halfway there, her mom pulled over on the side of the road, blinker ticking. She turned around and faced my mother. "You're a little whore," she said, and slapped my mother across the face. She then turned back around, checked her mirrors, and continued to the pharmacy where they're having a sale on Hanes, the leading brand of pantyhose in 1964. My mother met my father in Boston when she was 17. They were both attending a small communications school. My father had just returned from Korea after 2 years in the army. He had been a journalist with stars and stripes and once blundered into the DMZ, almost causing an international incident. He now wanted to be a disc jockey. My mother dreamt of becoming an actress. My mom, who still lived at home, was soon pregnant. When my father asked if they should get married, move up to New Hampshire to be closer to his family, my mother smiled. After my brother was born, my mother went to see the doctor for her first postpartum checkup. The doctor said she seemed healthy, asked how the baby was. My mother said he was good. "Great," he said, "because you're pregnant again." And I was born the following October. When I was 18, my mother remarried. That Thanksgiving, she invited her father over. She also invited her sisters. They were all waiting for him. We had a kind of dinner. Afterward, I snuck beers and drank them in my bedroom with my brother, who was on leave from the Marines. We listened very carefully. We heard many voices rise into a single knot in the dining room. As I looked out my bedroom window and watched my grandfather drive away, I understood I would never see him again. Weeks later, setting up the Christmas tree, my mother spoke to my stepfather, bewildered, and asked, "Why do I still love him?" It is April, and I am visiting my mother. We stand on her porch and look at what flowers are coming in this year and those which remain stubborn. She leads me around the yard and then to the fence, points out a long row of daffodils. I ask if she planted those bulbs in September. She laughs. She sounds young. She gets down on one knee and touches a petal. "These," she says, "these have always been my favorite." So I'm going to move up and to when I was in high school. And so my parents escaped the church that we were part of, this Pentecostal church, sort of like raised by Pentecostals. And then in high school, I became absolved by punk rock. And I discovered the one thing that seemed to speak to me besides drugs. And it was punk rock music in a way that nothing else could. And this particular essay is called, if I can find it, it's called Friction. The day after my 16th birthday, I noticed a small, sharp thing on my bedroom floor. I picked it up as if I'd been looking for it my whole life. It could have been metal or a piece of glass. I don't remember, but I do remember what it wasn't. It certainly wasn't a knife or a razor. Razors came later. And at that point, holding a tool whose only job was to cut would have been too obvious, and my actions telegraphed not just to the world, but to me. The item had to be as ambiguous as my intentions. If someone walked into my bedroom as I sat on the edge of my mattress, slicing back and forth across my bare thighs, and asked me what the hell was I doing, I could look up at them, holding this bent piece of anonymous whatever, and smile. "Oh, this old thing? Why, it's nothing at all." I loved bands like Fear, 7 Seconds, Circle Jerks, Black Flag. Punk rock allowed me the release that living in a small town didn't. When David pressed play on his tape deck in his parked car and the dead Kennedy shouted about Nazi punks and how they should fuck off, I grabbed Jules by his leather jacket and spun him around in the field we were drinking in. We spun faster. It was exhilarating not knowing how it would end. Tim passed a joint to Steph. B said 5 Balls of Power were playing in Kittery next week. Scooter said he was getting some acid from his friend in California. David opened the car door so we could all hear the music better. Finally, my spinning slowed and Jules held on to my shirt, laughing. I laughed too, kicking at the weeds and asking for another beer. No one could touch us. We were a million miles away from parents and cops. My mother's black eyeliner overran, stinging. Steph said next week his parents are out of town, party at his place. Later, Jack showed me the burn marks he made on his skin, a single repeating welt across his bare shoulder. "You just heat the tip of a lighter red hot," he said. There was this older punk from Arizona who now lived in Portsmouth. Steph spoke of him with a kind of reverence. "At this party, he took off his shirt," Steph said, "and then he dragged a razor straight across his chest from shoulder to shoulder." "Seriously?" I said. "Holy shit." "Fucking badass," Steph said. Steph's party was packed. Ed showed up late and held 2 beers, saying he needed to catch up. My sometimes girlfriend Laura was there, dressed like a fucking preppy, but she was beautiful, and I didn't really know how to talk to her. Steph then raised his hand at me across the dining room and glinted his prize, a fresh razor, between his fingers. He smiled. Upstairs in his room, we took a few hesitant swipes, small scratches high up on the shoulder, places our t-shirts would cover. A few kids hung around and gaped, duly impressed. I peppered the razor down the length of my right arm and then made 3 parallel lines from elbow to wrist. Dude, Ed said. Laura watched me closely. I don't like razors, she said, and left the room. Good, I thought. Fuck you. I then pushed the razor deep into my left arm, pulled. It opened like a baby's mouth. At first, the blood was shy, then it overran everything. I cut a tic-tac-toe board and felt no pain. I win, I thought. I woke up on Steph's bed, my left arm stuck to the sheet. It was Saturday, and my father was coming to pick me and my siblings up for the weekend. I washed my arm, but it started bleeding again. I wrapped the wound in toilet paper and pulled both sleeves down. The whole weekend I spent trying to hide what I'd done. My dad and his new wife were kind, tried to offer fun things for all of us to do. That night, we made buffalo wings. I watched as a chicken skin bubbled and contracted in the hot oil. My brother stirred the sauce on the stove, a slurry of bright red. Who's hungry? My dad said. In school on Monday, I showed Steph my arm and he laughed with me, said I was crazy. I know, I said, I know. We talked about the weekend, maybe going to Boston. Who's playing? I asked. Gangrene, Steph said. Okay, I'll see what I can do. I'm probably grounded. And we laughed at this, my running joke. I was always grounded. See you at lunch, I said. See you. I stood at my locker for an extra second, touched my sleeve, the ache beneath. I felt so lonely, I wanted to fall to my knees. Hey, you're late, Mr. Delcroix said, stepping from the language lab. I looked at him. He made it his personal mission to get David expelled. It worked. Not yet, I said, moving in the other direction. You're on my hit list, Locke, he called back. I hurried down the hallway, through the science wing and its corny posters about planets and the universe and how fun it is to learn. I imagined for a second what it would feel like to float in space, untethered, to slip past all those things that could hurt you. Now, I think if I left it there, that would just be cruel. So I really want to read something with a little more lift to it, just to end the reading. It's brief, but let me just say that on this piece, so I began some years back teaching at a federal prison, and sort of the communion I found with the men was incredibly powerful and important, and put a lot of things into perspective for me and allowed me to love and be loved, I think, in a way that was missing in some ways. And so I had one more class before I knew that the semester would be over, but I had them for about 8 weeks. And I knew this would be the last class that I would have with the men. And so this particular essay covers that whole time frame. It's called Voice. And there's an epigraph before from Reginald Dwayne Betts, who, if you don't know, I really encourage you to read his work. And it goes, all these words for love, all these ways to say believe. For the last class I would ever teach in the prison, I took 14 poems and laid them face down on a lacquered desk. 14 poems by 14 poets. All pieces that matter to me, have helped shape my life in some way. I told my students to come up one at a time and grab the poem on top, no peeking. I had no idea who would get which poem. I said, read that poem in your hand to the class. Out loud. They did. Much starting and halting, beginning again, stopping again. What does that word mean? Wait, this is about what? After all of them completed the task, I said, do not lose this poem. It is your poem. And by the end of the semester, you will recite this poem to me and this class by heart. It will have transformed into your own. There's no way that's possible. said one. Others smiled while shaking their heads, glances catching other glances. Mr. Bellows, a former Marine, stared at me as if trying to look right through me. I had my students recite familiar songs and nursery rhymes in unsuspecting ways. Mary had a little lamb in a whispering evil voice. Hickory dickory dock, as if terrified, looking back and forth over your shoulder. Happy birthday to you, sarcastically. Afterward, I asked what they remembered about the exercise. Yo, I seen Shorty bouncing around and shit like a creeper, said Mr. Hendricks, pointing at Mr. Micaiah. Oh yeah, I said. What else? We're all acting like we were crazy, said Mr. Tusky, a man from Chicago who was afraid parole would send him back to a community he no longer knew. You're right, I said. Then I turned and wrote attitude over aptitude on the whiteboard. Sometimes, I said, it's not what you say, but how you say it. The men were up practicing their descriptive speeches. Describe someone, someplace, or something that impacted your life, good or bad. And that night, Mr. Waters got up and spoke about his stepfather, Red, a country western singer who played at Gilley's nightclub from urban cowboy fame. Mr. Waters remembers how he was allowed to sing with Red and put out a pickle jar for tips to a packed house. Mr. Waters was 5 and the audience ate it up. Later, as Red slipped deeper and deeper into alcoholism, as his dreams of a gold record wouldn't materialize, he became increasingly abusive to Mr. Waters and his mother. After years of torment, Mr. Waters, then 21, went to visit Red for a promised night of drinking. He brought a case of beer and a 5th of Jack Daniels. At the end of the night, Mr. Waters went into the bathroom and took out a long hunting knife, ready to go back into the living room and kill Red. He looked in the mirror, breathed out once, and said, I'm ready. When he went back into the living room, Red was coughing hard and wet into a handkerchief. When he pulled it away, it was covered in blood. And that's when I knew God would do my work for me, Mr. Waters said to the class. So he sat down next to Red, patted his shoulder, and finished his beer instead. Mr. Russell went next. He's a large man, shoulders like wide metal rollers in a factory, wiry black beard, white kufi hat tight around his shaved head. He said on the night he was transferred to a new penitentiary 15 years ago, he sat up listening to a man being raped in the darkness 2 cells down. His own cellmate just laid there, not saying a thing. He wouldn't talk to me. He wouldn't say a thing as this man cried for help. I kept thinking, why don't you say anything? What am I doing here? Mr. Russell converted to Islam in the coming weeks and said it is the one thing that has saved him even now. Afterward, I thanked the men. I told them they were growing more and more comfortable speaking in front of each other, that their stories were powerful and they courageous. Packing up and getting ready for the move back up the hill, Mr. Kinney, who's a dazzling painter and has completed dozens of portraits of the men utilizing different shades of violet to highlight their cheekbones, said, Mr. Locke, you're no CO, because you know why? Because COs don't save lives. I didn't know how to respond, so I just said what you're supposed to say when given a gift. I thanked him. Every class, between all the exercises, challenges, and setbacks, small victories, the men practiced those poems I gave them, all 14. They studied, they spoke, they whispered their poems. They filled our small room with great sounds as they stretched those words into creation, sometimes in groups, sometimes to themselves. For Mr. Cortez, I rewrote many of the words to his poem, I Have Good News by Tony Hoagland, phonetically. The English is his second language, and he hadn't graduated high school in the Dominican Republic, a baseball career derailed at age 16. There was much struggle for the men. There were so many who quit, said they would try again, and then quit again, only to again try. But in our last class together, what power in their presentations, what ownership of language. These poems all along were more theirs than I even realized or planned. Mr. Rialto, who'd previously never read a poem in his life, joked before we started that Galway Kinnell's blackberry eating had become his poem of seduction, of lust. I recited it to my girl over the phone the other day, replaced blackberry with a very different word. He smiled. The men in class let out a satisfied howl. And Mr. Waters, who bravely recited To Myself by Franz Wright, During the semester, he informed me that he was incarcerated for manufacturing and distributing meth, was an addict himself. He openly wept in class in front of the men during one of his speeches, the one about Red, as he thanked them all for being vulnerable and for allowing him to be the same. When Mr. Waters said, quote, and the catastrophic dawn, the nicotine crawling on your skin, and when you begin to cough, I won't cover my face. And if you vomit this time, I will hold you. Everything's going to be fine. I believed him, the dignity in his face. And Mr. Russell, who read Jim Daniels' Wheels, about the speaker's brother always waving in photographs from behind the wheel of a car or truck or motorbike. We all learned in class just the other night that Mr. Russell's younger brother died at age 13 because he snuck out in the family car and crashed at 100 miles per hour. So when Mr. Russell looked at us and said, quote, my brother's feet rarely touched the ground, waving, face pressed to the wind, no camera to save him, we realized the poem was now a caddish. And Mr. Tusky knew firsthand of the gangs in Chicago, but vowed for something better for his two children when he gets out, read Kazim Ali's Rain. And when he recited with such force, quote, I am a dark bowl waiting to be filled. If I open my mouth now, I could drown in the rain. I hurry home as though someone is there waiting for me. The night collapses into your skin. I am the rain. I was both thrilled and memorized because there could be no way he was lying. And Mr. Cortez, he read every line of Hoagland's poem as a plea. Quote, the dark ending does not cancel out the brightness of the middle. Your day of greatest joy cannot be dimmed by any shame. And when he finished, I put my hands together and filled the room with noise, as did the men. And we were happy then, bound together by something closer to love. Thanks.